Before a single Mongol soldier set foot inside a city, the city was already broken. Imagine you are the ruler of a great walled fortress. You have thousands of soldiers, years' worth of food stored, and walls thick enough to stop any army on earth. Then one morning a lone messenger arrives at your gate, not a soldier, just a man on a horse carrying a single piece of paper. The message reads, "Surrender now, or every living thing inside your walls will be erased." Not soldiers. Every living thing. And here is the part that destroys you. You already know what happened to the last city that said no. You have heard the stories. You have seen the refugees with hollow eyes who could barely speak. You know about the rivers that ran red for 3 days. The silence where a civilization used to be. So what do? History tells us that most of the time, rulers open the gate. Not because the Mongols were already inside, but because the Mongols had already won the war inside the ruler's mind before the army ever arrived. This is the story of the most ruthless psychological warfare machine in all of human history. The Mongols did not stumble onto fear as a weapon by accident. Under Genghis Khan, psychological destruction was a deliberate and engineered military doctrine. It worked in precise stages, and every stage was calculated. After destroying a city, the Mongols would often intentionally allow a portion of the surviving population to escape. This was not mercy. This was strategy. Every refugee who fled carrying first-hand accounts of the massacre was an unpaid psychological soldier marching directly toward the next target. They spread the story with their own trembling voices, which made it more believable and more terrifying than any official proclamation could ever be. The Mongols understood something that no military school of that era formally taught. A demoralized enemy is already more than half defeated. When the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful empires in the entire Islamic world at that time, received word that the Mongols were approaching, entire garrisons of trained soldiers abandoned their posts and disappeared into the desert before a single arrow was fired. The empire fractured not because of battlefield losses but because fear had already eaten through its spine. The Mongol army just arrived to collect what fear had already won. The massacres themselves were not simply violence. They were performances, and the Mongols understood the difference completely. After taking a city that had dared to resist, Mongol commanders would sometimes construct towers and pyramids built entirely from human skulls outside the ruins. This practice was not born from madness or rage. It was a message written in the only language that crossed every cultural and linguistic barrier of the medieval world, the language of absolute, undeniable consequence. Travelers, merchants, spies, and diplomats would pass these towers and carry the image with them for the rest of their lives. The Persian historian Juvayni documented multiple cases of cities whose populations simply walked outside their own walls to surrender before the Mongol army had even come into view, having heard nothing more than second-hand descriptions of what had happened elsewhere. When the Mongol forces arrived at Baghdad in 1258, the city that housed the greatest library and intellectual center in the Islamic world at the time, the caliph hesitated and delayed rather than organizing a defense. Paralysis had set in. Fear had already done the siege work before the siege began. The Mongols also engineered the psychological offer they gave to every enemy, and this offer was its own weapon. The structure was always identical: surrender completely, submit fully, pay tribute, and you will not only survive but be protected and allowed to continue your trade and your life. Resist even slightly, and the destruction will be so complete that your name will exist only as a warning to others. This two-path structure was brilliant in its brutality because it forced every defender into a psychological trap from which there was no clean exit. Submission meant humiliation and the loss of sovereignty. Resistance meant a near-certain annihilation of everyone the ruler was responsible for protecting. By the time the Mongol forces appeared outside the walls, the ruler's own merchants, clerics, and ordinary citizens were often already begging for surrender because fear had filtered down through every layer of society. The Mongols weaponized hope just as precisely as they weaponized terror. And on the occasions when a city like Urgench or Nishapur chose to resist and fight, the Mongols ensured the punishment was so total and so thoroughly documented that it worked as permanent advertising for every future target across the continent. Here is where the story becomes genuinely surprising. because fear as a military weapon had limits, and when those limits were reached, they revealed exactly how the entire mechanism worked. In Japan, the Mongol invasion fleet was twice obliterated by typhoons that the Japanese called kamikaze, meaning divine winds, and without the ability to land and establish a reputation on Japanese soil, the psychological infrastructure simply never had a chance to take hold. More revealing was what happened in Egypt in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut. The Mamluk Sultanate, whose soldiers were formerly enslaved warriors raised from childhood inside a military culture that specifically trained them to suppress fear and embrace death as an honorable outcome, refused to break. They had no historical memory of Mongol invincibility the way other peoples did, and their psychological architecture was simply not vulnerable to the lever the Mongols depended on. They met the Mongol force in open battle and they won. It was the first significant battlefield defeat the Mongols had suffered against a major power, and it cracked something fundamental in the myth of their unstoppability. This tells us that the entire system ran on a reputation that had to be continuously fed with actual demonstrated terror. The moment someone called the bluff, held their nerve, and survived, the machine began to lose its power. The Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in the entire history of the world. And the most unsettling truth buried inside that fact is this. A significant portion of that empire was assembled while the shadow of what the Mongols built did not disappear when their empire fragmented. Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, who rose to power in Central Asia in the late 14th century, explicitly modeled his terror campaigns on Mongol precedent, including the construction of skull towers outside cities that had resisted him. The Ottoman Empire used structured surrender ultimatums with clearly promised consequences throughout its expansion across 3 continents. Modern military strategists writing about the doctrine of shock and awe, the idea of using overwhelming force and spectacle to collapse an enemy's will to fight before conventional battle determines the outcome, are describing a principle the Mongols had already mastered on horseback across the steppes of Asia 8 centuries earlier. What the Mongols proved with empirical and historical completeness is that the most powerful weapon ever deployed in warfare is not a sword, a cannon, a siege engine, or a bomb. It is the story an enemy tells themselves in the dark about what is coming for them. Without a decisive battle ever taking place, the gates simply opened. Because fear, when it is constructed with patience, backed by a reputation built on genuine and witnessed atrocity, and delivered with the precision of a message rather than the chaos of a slaughter, becomes an invisible army. That army travels faster than horses, crosses walls without ladders, and defeats defenders before they ever lift a weapon. The Mongols did not simply conquer kingdoms. They conquered the imagination of kingdoms. And once the imagination surrenders, everything else is already over.